This e-lecture is about translating idioms. We'll start off just revisiting last week's topic, which was metaphors. We'll then also briefly look at the translation process, and then we'll look at what idioms are, two different types of idioms, and how we can deal with them in translation. So metaphors, as you might remember, are expressions that conceptualize one thing in terms of another on the basis of some sort of perceived similarity. All right, so often we will describe one thing, but we will use sort of imagery, right? So we will use we will describe another thing, but we sort of feel like there is some sort of similarity between the two items. So we also looked at last week the communicative translation model, and we tried to apply it at the micro level and saw how that was helpful when it comes to translating metaphors. Now, idioms, we can use the same strategy actually, and they are similarly tricky, if not more tricky than metaphors, and you'll see how in a minute. So here we have the communicative model of the translation process, and again we are sort of focusing on the middle here, obviously the role of the translator, and how the translator both first decodes, right, the source text or the message, and then encodes it, right, into the target text. And actually this model, we can also apply that at the micro level to aid us in the translation of idioms. So idioms are larger chunks or strings of words or units that consist of several words. So basically there's more than one word in an idiom, right? But the meaning of the idiom as a whole cannot be predicted on the basis of any of the words inside it, because it's the entire string which carries meaning. So this is how it's also different from metaphors, all right, where we describe one thing in terms of another thing on the basis of a similarity. I mean, here the meaning of an idiom has absolutely nothing to do with the words inside the idiom, right, inside that unit. So here are some examples. Straight from the horse's mouth is an example from English, raining cats and dogs. So obviously if we say that it's raining cats and dogs, we mean that it's raining heavily. But there's nothing about the term cats and dogs. There's no similarity here, right, between cats and or dogs and the fact that the rain is coming down heavily. All right, there's no perceived similarity. Indeed, the meaning of the individual words, so that the cat and the dog, for instance, has absolutely nothing to do with the amount of rain coming down. All right, so this is a good example of how the meaning of the individual words have absolutely nothing to do with the meaning of the idiom itself. We obviously also have idioms in Danish, for instance, to binde på nakken. Again, this means to sort of get out of somewhere, or to hurry up, to be quick about something, to exit in sort of very fast manner. And again, this obviously may be done by running, quite possibly, but then, so maybe there's something with some legs, but why you want to put them on your neck, or right? So again, if we're trying to look at the meaning of the individual words and sort of match that against what the idiom means, we come at, we're at a loss basically, because the individual words, the meaning of those don't match the meaning of the idiom. So idioms are fixed expressions. They're basically culturally embedded, right? So an idiom is something that exists in one language and has a particular meaning in that language as one unit. And they don't necessarily, you won't find similar ones in other languages, right? So they're very culturally embedded in that way. So some of them may actually look like metaphors, and they may have come from metaphors at some point actually, but they have somehow become part of the language as a single unit or a single chunk, right? We treat the idiom as one unit. So the individual words have actually lost their meaning, and it's only the meaning of the entire string or the entire chunk or the entire unit that remains. So sometimes it can be useful to distinguish between two different types of idioms. We have grammatical idioms and we have extra grammatical idioms. So grammatical idioms, they seem to follow the rules of grammar. Okay, so they still don't make sense if you compare the meaning of the individual words and the sort of the string of words. All right, so we have open a can of worms. It means that you sort of a lot of bad things start happening to you, possibly because of something that you did. All right, open up your mind. Again, there is perhaps some sort of perceived similarity between openness, open windows, open doors, and then maybe your mind, but still it's not completely clear. But what we can see when we look at these idioms is that they do obey the rules of grammar, right? If you pull someone's leg, there's a verb there, pull someone, there's genitive marker there, their leg, brilliant, right? So there's nothing grammatically wrong with these units, even though they can be difficult to understand. But extra grammatical idioms, they violate grammatical rules. And that means that here we have some examples. Trip the light, fantastic. Normally we would say that something, if a light, let's say that you do have a fantastic light, you would say trip the fantastic light. All right, I don't even know how you would trip it necessarily. It's apparently a verb somehow, or maybe it's a noun, who knows. But again, there's definitely the placement there of the adjective fantastic. There's happy-go-lucky. Again, two adjectives with the verb in the middle, and so on, right? So these, they are idioms, they're expressions that we find in English, but they don't actually obey grammatical rules. Now, when it comes to translation, the grammatical idioms can be hard to spot because they sort of look like normal language in a way, right? They definitely play by the rules of grammar. They can be hard to spot, but they're usually fairly easy to understand. And a top tip for spotting these in a text, and that's obviously step one when you have to translate, is that the meaning of the words of the idiom will not fit thematically with the rest of the text. So if you have a text that's about something and all of a sudden a protagonist or something, it says that they opened a can of worms, you sort of have to think to yourself, did they actually open a can of worms, or do we have another meaning here? And indeed they may have opened a can of worms quite literally, but perhaps there is a different meaning indicated, and then you have the idiom. So I think thinking about the content, the meaning of the actual words themselves, relating that to the rest of the sentence, the rest of the text, right? Then you figure out, does that actually make sense? If not, it's because you have an idiom, because the words themselves in the idiom are not part of the meaning of the idiom. Extra grammatical idioms are easier to spot because they violate grammatical rules. So if something looks a bit weird on the page and you think, hang on, this is a grammatical error, it might actually just be an idiom. Because they violate grammatical rules, they can also be harder to understand. And obviously that also means that they are harder to translate. And that is because they are so culturally embedded. All idioms are culturally embedded, of course, but these extra grammatical ones, if you're not aware of them, they do seem rather odd, right? They just seem like a lot of words bundled together. So what do we do when we translate idioms? Whether or not they're grammatical, idioms are really problematic, and mainly that is because there is no equivalent idiom in the target language. That means that you cannot simply translate it literally, because then the idiomatic meaning wouldn't come across. So obviously this is a problem, because idioms are these units, right? Larger chunks that consist of several words, but the meanings of these words sort of don't really play into the meaning of the idiom itself. So the meaning of the idiom cannot be predicted on the basis of any of the words. So obviously we can say åbne en dåse orm, for open a can of worms. This may very well take place in some sort of novel or something, but if it's the idiomatic expression, then this is not an adequate translation. A slap on the back, it's slag på tasken. Again, this is an idiom. If you give somebody it's lau betesken, right? It means that you estimate a price or a value. This again does not actually come across if you translate this sort of word by word. I really like the one that says king carrot. Okay, kong gulerod. Again, this is an expression that we have in Danish, and we have some associations with this expression, but it simply does not work if you just translate it straight across. So how do we deal with these idioms? Well, if we just revisit the sort of the translation process here, it's sort of very similar to what we did for metaphors. So when you encode the meaning, all right, you basically have to find a target language expression which expresses the same thing as what you decoded over here, right? As what you decoded from the source text. And for idioms, you have three options. You can find a similar or near identical idiom in the target language which captures the same meaning. That's one. Now, these are sort of rare. It's rare that you're able to do this, but you may actually just be able to do that. You may also be able to find an idiom which actually captures the same meaning, but it's completely different, right? So it actually captures the same meaning, but sort of on the surface, you cannot actually tell because the sort of the contents of the idiom, the words inside it are completely different. But still, it's an idiom. As long as it captures the same meaning, you're good, right? It's absolutely fine to use. However, you're probably often better off simply by translating the content of the idiom directly, so that what you end up with is no longer an idiom, but you have simply translated the meaning. So obviously this is also playing it safe, right? Sometimes that may be perfectly okay. Sometimes it's not a very good solution because there are obviously sort of connotations linked with particular idioms, and again, certain authors may have certain writing styles where idioms play a large part. So obviously, you aren't losing some meaning, maybe not sort of the direct or the sort of literal meaning, but you are losing some of the connotational meanings of the idioms. But let's look at some examples. So here's an example where we can actually choose a similar or near identical idiom. So here is a sentence. It's important to keep an open mind. So first we identify the idiom and its open mind. We then have to figure out what does it mean. So we could possibly say that open mind indicates tolerance, perhaps openness to new ideas and so on. So we then have to think about, do we in Danish have a similar idiom which can capture the same thing? And we do actually. Here we could just say åbent sind, and that's perfectly okay. So this one is pretty easy. We actually can just more or less translate it word for word, right? Because we're so lucky that the idiom is the same. Actually, it's very, very similar. Sometimes we can also select another idiom which just has the same or similar meaning. So we here have an example sentence. Jeg giver dig smadder. So again, the idiom here is de smadder. We have to figure out what does that actually mean. It probably means something along the lines of beating up, right? You want to beat somebody up. All right, can we come up with a good idiom in English that means the same thing? Kick ass is a good suggestion, all right? It's also an idiom, means the same thing. It doesn't look like de smadder at all, but you know, you're capturing the same meaning. So this would be a good translation. All right, where we have actually managed to find another idiom with the same meaning. Finally, we may not be able to find an idiom, so we might just have to go with the direct translation of the idiomatic content. So again, we first identify the idiom, all right, which is trip the light fantastic here. What does that mean? It actually means dancing, all right, so that's what it means. We're maybe not able to find a good idiom, so we just have to go with the idiomatic content, so danse, right? So obviously we can translate it into de danse. You could argue, well, could we say de svingede trappen? That's actually an idiom in Danish, all right? But I'm not too keen on that translation because I don't think it quite captures the same meaning, sort of the connotations, as the original, right? As the source text expression. So my top tips for how to translate idioms. First of all, remember that we can apply the translation process model at the micro level, and that means first we actually have to identify the idiom. We have to find it first, right, and figure out that it's an idiom and try to then decode the meaning, right? What does it actually mean? And then we can translate that either by choosing another idiom, either one that is similar or one that is different but has the same meaning, or we can translate the idiomatic meaning, right? So looking at the idiom as one unit, what is the meaning of that, and we translate that, okay? So try to then move away from looking at the meaning of the words inside the idiom, right? The literal meaning. And that's a recipe for disaster. Now, spotting idioms, right, and then dealing with them actually takes very good knowledge of both Danish and English, obviously, in order to spot them. All right, you need quite high proficiency of Danish and of English in order to spot idioms in either Danish or English, and then also to decode them and then to provide an adequate translation. And the best way, I think, to be able to do that is to immerse yourself in both languages, really, in order to achieve this, right? So in order to achieve this high knowledge and proficiency, and also just to stay up to date with contemporary language, right? And sort of natural language, spoken language, how it's used in a range of different settings. So reading lots of different types of texts, obviously reading, listening, watching, all of that. They're all very, very good sources if you are actually not able to obviously travel and immerse yourself in the language sort of for a longer period of time.